Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This is Salim Badat and Brother Ebrahim Jadwat for Living Islam. Today I thought of covering some politics, okay, but modern politics, I think starting from the Ottoman. From the Ottoman, we're looking at what year after the First World War?
First World War, 14,
So Brother Ibrahim, first, thank you for being here and always a pleasure having you. So if we had to start, so can we start from the Ottoman and slowly come to present age, the challenges of the Muslim Ummah and the tapestry that that we're facing now.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It is such a period of testing for the Ummah. The first time in our history that we do not, at the end of the First World War, not had a Khalifa. Going back a little bit and very briefly, when the Ottoman under Mehmed II conquered Constantinople, it was a fulfillment of the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, who said there will be arise a great nation with a great leader who will take Constantinople. Constantinople represented the capital of the Eastern Christian Roman Empire. They were in that part of the world, in the Middle East, and as Muslims conquered territory and people started accepting Islam, like Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, so the Eastern Roman Empire was shrinking, and it ended up in Constantinople. And Constantinople became the bastion of the Christian Eastern Roman Empire. So from 1452, when the Muslims took Mehmed II to Constantinople, to 1923, that's 500 years of Ottoman rule. And you cannot imagine our ignorance about this 500-year rule. But we'll skip that for another day. When the First World War started, at the time the Ottomans were under tremendous pressure, and you might remember that Turkey was called the sick man of Europe, because this huge whale in the ocean was being attacked from every side. The French were attacking the Muslim lands, North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Syria. The British were attacking Egypt and Jordan and Palestine. So there was tremendous, and the Portuguese were attacking, the Italians were in Libya. So we were in a dire straits during the beginning of the First World War. So the Ottoman Sultan and Ottomans decided that they would side with Germany, because Germany had not occupied 1 square meter of Muslim lands, in the hope that if the Germans won, then the British and the French and the Spanish, Portuguese, Italians would all have to leave the Muslim lands.
Did the Ottomans have an option to stay neutral, or were they forced to take a side?
No, that is a strange anomaly. They had the option to stay out of it.
It would have been safer.
But the Ottomans were also a fighting nation, and they were being humiliated all over the Ottoman Empire,
Right.
not just from the attacks of the European powers, but the attacks from within,
Right.
the rise of nationalism. So all this was a very difficult time for the Ottoman and the Sultan, and he felt that if he joined Germany and they won the war, all this will come to an end. So you're absolutely right. They had the option to join. But at the time, whether the powers, British and French especially, whether after winning or losing the First World War, they were going to come after the Ottomans anyway. And they had now reached a stage of superiority in arms and other things. So it was a very difficult period, and the Ottomans, if I may say, made the mistake of joining the First World War, 1914, 1918. And in that time, the Germans lost. But before that, the British and the French and their allies had tried to take Constantinople, right? So they sent the Armada, French and British Armada, to the Straits of Dardanelles in the hope that they thought that the Turks' resistance would be low. But the Turkish forces at the time, even before Ataturk, were very powerful and very loyal and very strong, and they did not allow this armada to succeed. So the biggest warships of the time, the biggest warships of the French and British, were sunk in the Straits of Dardanelles. This was followed later, before the end of the First World War, that there was this huge invasion, right, taking place. The idea was to take over Constantinople and the Turkish territories, and with the help of the Greeks, right, and the forces, Allied forces, right. So the Muslims and the Turks fought valiantly, right, and it's a thing that is there, celebrated every year, right. The loss of 1 million Allied forces, right, in the Battle of Gallipoli. You want to study Gallipoli as a subject. Dardanelles earlier and Gallipoli. What a fight they put up. And they defeated the French and the British. But the overall war in which the Germans were fighting, the overall war was won by the Allies and lost by the Germans. So that was the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire, with people like Ataturk coming in and establishing a secular Turkey.
Right.
And that is a sad period. In 1923, they go to the Sultan, they are called the Young Turks, and they ask the Sultan to abdicate. Among those that came with Ataturk were the Jews of Turkey, whom Muslims had given accommodation at the end of Spain, when they were expelled from Spain. So these Jews had come earlier to the Sultan and offered him a blank check, provided the Sultan gave them Palestine. And the Sultan told him that this is 1912, not over my dead body. So at the end of the First World War, the Sultan had to abdicate, 1923. And for the first time, we were left without a Sultan.
Okay, so as we're moving now, as we move along, I know India played a role for the reinstatement of the Khilafah, correct? A small role. There was a Khilafah movement in India. But the irony of it is that they were asking Britain to reinstate the Khilafah, because that I know.
You see, this shows how weak we were, that you're going to ask the very people that destroyed your Khilafah to help you to reinstate it. That's an amazing thing. But it wasn't India per se. The Khilafah movement was in India and Pakistan, and the Khilafah movement was basically aiming for the reinstatement of the Khalifa.
Right.
So it wasn't something that the Khilafah movement was just basically wanting that the Khalifa must be reinstated.
Right. So, okay, so as we move on now, obviously the Hijaz now is taken over by the Saudis. Okay, so just give us a bit of how they came on, the Lawrence of Arabia, and there were many Lawrence of Arabia, how they were used to create nationalism and the nationalist movements that came out of it in the Middle East, like the Ba'ath movement and Nasser. So just briefly.
You see, one of the tools that they used, the British and the French, and the British in particular, divide and rule.
Yeah.
Right? So they found a weakness in the Arab world where they felt the local chieftains, right, I will tell you the South African equivalent of the Bantustan chiefs.
Yeah.
The Bantustan chiefs were just basically interested in their little world.
Right.
So they were easily bought off by people like Lawrence of Arabia. He was one of many. His basic philosophy was, he told the Arabs, "You're Arabs, why are you allowing the Turks to rule over you?" And this was a touchy point. So they revolted, sided with people like Lawrence and the British, with the promise that they'll get the world. Right? They will side with us and we'll give you this and that and that. But it was all part of the plan that the British have done, the French have done, divide and rule and occupy and conquer, and then take control. So that was the sad period between the First World War at the end of the Khilafah and the Second World War, during which time a lot of the Muslim lands, Arab lands, were occupied.
I think a very significant tragedy as well is the Balfour Declaration, and how the Muslims, and how the British decided to Lord Balfour, with the Balfour. So you're going to give us some history of what the Balfour did and what it meant for us.
You see, first understand that when General Allenby, 1919, when he enters Jerusalem, he crossed the bridge that's still known as the Allenby Bridge. And his words as he crossed over, "This day the Crusades have come to an end." Understand, from the time the first crusade, for 1,000 years, they tried many times to take back Jerusalem, and they couldn't. And at the end of the First World War, General Allenby said, "This day the Crusades have come to an end." The beginning of the occupation of Palestine by those that they felt would do the job for them, namely the Zionists. So in 1923, when the Khilafah ended, the period of movement of people, now remember, 1919, the communists take power in Russia, right? From then, throughout the 1920s and 30s, Hitler is on his campaign, right? The unification of Germany and the war with the French and the British, and of course his arch enemies, the Jews. So this animosity that was there was growing and growing, and the Jews of Germany and Central Europe and even Russia now found it comfortable with the occupation of the Holy Land by the British mandate to start sending people over. So by the shiploads, people were coming. Shiploads of Jews were coming from Europe and from Russia.
This is interesting. At the end of the First World War, so there's two things that came out of this. One was, well, three things. One was the destruction of the Khilafah, the Ottoman. Second was the creation of Israel, and the third was the rise of communism, which is actually the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yes.
So these were Jews, Bolshevik Jews,
Yeah.
and we know the destruction that communists, that the communism.
But remember, the most important thing is that we lost Jerusalem. That was the most. That was the Nakba.
That was the Nakba.
We left. We were left without, and the Arab armies that got together were the same people in cahoots with the British. So what force did they have to fight a well-organized Zionist movement trained to kill? And we know of the gangs that were there,
Sure.
the Irgun gang and all these other gangs. They were just there to exterminate. In the philosophy of Europeans and British, that these third world countries are not, the people are not human, they are subhuman, and to eliminate them should not be a problem. So they killed and killed. They destroyed over a few thousand villages in Palestine.
Was this the Nakba we speak of?
Yes,
The Nakba.
the Nakba.
What about Sabra and Shatila? Maybe you can go to that as well. The history of Sabra and Shatila.
You see, in the middle of all of this, right, we had the fifth column of the Christians in Lebanon.
Right.
The shrinking population of Christians after the end of the First and Second and Third Crusade. Most of them were not Semitic. They were European.
Ashkenazi.
Ashkenazi.
Ashkenazi, yes.
But what was left was die-hard Christians in Lebanon.
Okay.
The die-hard Christians in Lebanon, the French made Lebanon a separate country. It was always a part of Syria. Lebanon was always a part of Syria.
Okay.
But the French made Lebanon because there was a fairly large number of Christians. So the population was divided into three: the Christians, Sunnis, and Shia. So the power was distributed with the three, with the most powerful people being in the Christians, right?
Right.
Now, they hated the idea of any kind of support for the Palestinians.
Okay.
The Palestinians, at the end of 1948, when Israel was created, they were ambushed at every turn. Their villages were destroyed. So they sought refuge in the neighboring countries, in Jordan, in Syria, in Egypt, and all these places, right? But the Christian phalange in Lebanon did not want. See, Lebanon is the closest thing to Palestine. So a large population of Palestinians had moved into Lebanon and Jordan and Syria. So the Christian phalange wanted to control Lebanon and hated the idea of the Palestinians being in Lebanon. So they orchestrated the plan together with the Zionists. Now you must remember, in some of these places, the Shabra and Shatila, there were more than 500,000 in each. So together with the connivance, the Zionists were very keen to work with the Christians to eliminate the Palestinians. Hence, under the cover of the Israeli army and security, the phalange went to town and massacred thousands of people in these towns, right? The Shabra and Shatila in particular, but others as well. So they committed a genocide, and because of that, and because they were uncovered, their plans failed, but it costed a lot of lives, right? But their plans failed. So Shabra and Shatila became the center of the revival, right, of Muslims in Lebanon, and the beginning of Hezbollah, right? So the biggest losers in Lebanon were the Christian phalange. Now they were humiliated for what they did in collaboration with the Zionists, and now they found themselves at a loose end. And the only protection they could seek, can you believe it, was the protection of Hezbollah. So now this Christian phalange are now partners with Hezbollah in Lebanon. It's an anomaly that the Christian party is now so-called in bed with the Muslim party.
I think whilst we're talking about the Palestinian issue and the struggle, maybe a bit of history of Yasser Arafat, the PLO, the inception of the PLO, and then once we've done that, then maybe Hamas, and Sheikh Yassin, and a bit on, and then we can move away from here. So let's talk about the PLO.
You see, PLO was part of the movement at the time of nationalist structures.
Right.
So we talked about Syria and Iraq having Baathist parties.
Right.
And Baathism
Right.
was a party that was created by Michael Aflaq, who was a Greek Arab of Greek origin, and how to break the monopoly of Islam. So to create the Baath party, they established a non-sectarian party.
Okay.
And one of the things that Michael Aflaq was fond of saying is that Islam did not make Arabs great, Arabs made Islam great. In other words, we don't need Islam to regain our independence, to regain our power and so forth. So he was the person that founded Baath Party in Syria and the same Baath Party in Iraq. At the same time, Nasser in Egypt was establishing Arab nationalism, and it's called Nasserism. And people like Gaddafi and others were inspired by Nasser, and they established a Nasser.
So I think we'll get to Gaddafi and from the Nasser movement, and we'll get to Saddam Hussein from the Baathist movement. But let's the PLO. So tell me about the inception of the PLO.
Right. So part of the nationalist movement in the Arab world, right? The support they were getting from the governments who did not really want them to succeed.
Right.
Right. So they helped them to make sure that Islamic parties and Islamic Muslims, right, would not gain control of the struggle for Palestine.
Right.
Understand?
Yes.
Right. So they made it into nationalist struggle.
Right.
When I met the people of Palestine in the late 60s, they were so horrified that I would even mention that we as Muslims are struggling for Palestine. For them, it was an Arab nationalist struggle, and they wanted a wider audience than a Muslim audience. So I said, how can you expect that when the Muslims, the heart of the Muslim land, is beating in Al-Aqsa, and how we are as Muslims concerned about the past, but they didn't bat an eyelid. They were not concerned that whether you did or didn't support. They didn't want your support as Muslims. They wanted your support because they wanted a nationalistic philosophy to rule over. And they never succeeded.
Sure.
And they never succeeded. So then comes Hezbollah and Hamas. The Islamic movement, there was a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled by the Ikhwan people, and they made Hamas and Hezbollah.
So we move away from that. Now let's talk about the rise of Saddam Hussein, the role he played with the Iran-Iraq war, obviously being a puppet of America, and all of that, and obviously at the end his destruction. So let's talk about Saddam Hussein and how America used him.
Okay, all of these nationalistic parties, whether it's the Baath Party in Syria, or the Baath Party in Iraq, or the nationalist parties in the rest of the Arab world, they had one thing in common: keep Islam out. That was the common factor. Keep Islam out, right? And they introduced un-Islamic tendencies, right? For example, in that time, they glorified the pharaohs to the point where they wanted to forget that this is a Muslim land.
Mm-hmm.
And Arab nationalism meant that Islam had a role as a cultural dimension of Arab nationalism.
Right.
So Gaddafi's Green Book talks about Arab nationalism, scientific socialism, Arab culture, right? So the minorities, both in Syria and in Iraq, you must remember that Hafiz al-Assad is a Nusayri, right? And their form of Shiaism is rejected by the Shias because they regard Nabi, the Prophet Hazrat Ali as the equivalent of Nabi Isa as son of God. They're completely out of the fold of Islam. But now, Hafiz al-Assad is a military person, and within this group of people who are fighting for independence and all that, he wrested control,
Okay.
right, in the army
Right.
and in the Baath Party.
I think before we get to Syria, my question was regarding Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, same thing.
So, okay.
Same thing.
And how he was used to fight the Iranians.
Yeah, we'll come to
and
that.
he gassed
You
them.
see, again, like Syria and like Hafiz al-Assad, Tikrit is the hometown of Saddam Hussein,
Yes.
Takrit. So he's known as Saddam Hussein Takriti, right? And Takrit was the place where the worst elements of Iraqi society
Sure.
thrived. It was as if it was the place where the gangsters of the Arab world were living and were brought up. It was a place where the worst thugs in the Arab world had emerged. And among those thugs, one of them was Saddam Hussein. He had no problem in killing his two deputies, pulled out a gun and shot them in front of the Baath party. So he was a person, Saddam Hussein Takriti, who had no qualms at all. He was a nationalist of the worst kind. He had no problem in killing his own people, like Syria. They had no problem. Nasser had no problem killing their own people. So you understand how difficult that time was. And so many of the people that we are associated with in the Islamic movement came from Iraq and came from Syria. But they were all on the hit list of Saddam Hussein. So Saddam Hussein was a thug.
So why was Saddam Hussein used as a pawn to fight Iran at that time?
You see, aspirations, the idea that I will be ruling over and being the so-called almost king of the Arab world. That's what they promised him.
Right. Who promised him? America.
Everybody,
Okay.
right? America and the Saudis
Okay.
and the Yemenis and the Bahrainis, not the Yemenis, and all of the and Egyptians, they all got around. He was a weak person and he was easily influenced. So he decided that he will take the offer of getting the Arab world. Right? So they encouraged him to fight Iran in the hope that if he won, they'll probably give him something. But still he would be under the control of the Americans. So with the support of the Saudis and the other neighboring countries and America, they armed him to the teeth, and at the weakest time, when Iran had just had their revolution, when the army was in disarray, when everything was chaotic in Iran, he launched his war against Iran. And they promised him so many sections of Iran where the oil fields were. So he was bought off literally by what was offered to him. And the 8-year war that he fought, right, thousands and thousands of people on both sides were killed. People could not move, and especially he had no problem using chemical war. You know, you just spread chemical war, thousands of people died. He had no problem doing that, and he did that.
So in spite of having the backing of the Western world and backing of the Arab world and having sophisticated armor and armory and army, yet they were not successful against Iran in the end, were they?
Because they were not able to deal with the human factor. You see, in Islam there's one thing. Why we conquered the world? We conquered the world because we had no fear of ourselves, of dying. The moment you reach that phase in your life, you have victory. So the Iranians, the concept of marja and the concept of shahada, the order of the marja, the order of the Khomeini and Khilafah, the whole celebration of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein leads them to want to get martyrdom. So they are keen for martyrdom. And any nation that is keen on martyrdom are not defeatable.
Sure.
And so the struggle went on for 8 years. And when thousands and thousands and thousands of people on both sides, when hundreds and hundreds of cities were flattened on both sides, where the war just could not be won, and Saddam Hussein realized that. And when it could not be won, they made a deal and they closed the door.
So when did the hostage incident take place? The Iranian embassy, was it American embassy in Iran?
Yes.
When did that take place?
That took place very soon after the revolution.
Oh, so that was before the before
Yeah,
the,
before that.
Oh, okay, okay.
You see, the revolution created a very difficult period, like what has happened in Afghanistan.
Yes.
At the end of Afghanistan's, the Americans leaving, it was a very tight situation, and they left behind so many things. I mean, the biggest trade that's going on at the moment is an American's uniform, selling the American shirts and caps and hats and shoes and all that. Right? Big trade, right? So they left hundreds of vehicles, trucks and vans and buggies, hundreds of equipment, right? And they ran. The same thing happened in Iran. When the revolution took place and the Shah left, when the American embassy people realized that all the shenanigans would be exposed, so they started to destroy them, shred them. By the thousands, the documents were being shredded. So they were trying to hide their plans and the program of the Shah and so forth.
All the
right?
conspiracies, yeah.
All the conspiracies, right? So that's when the youth of the time invaded the embassy and protected whatever was left.
Okay, so that was the reason for the hostage taking and the.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move away from that. So let's talk about how Saddam Hussein was tricked in invading Kuwait.
You see, when at the end of the 8-year war with Iran, he had nothing to show for it.
Right.
Thousands of his youth, Nojahan, were dead. A lot of his resources were depleted. Many of his cities were destroyed. And now he's looking around and saying to himself and to his advisors, what are we going to tell the people? We lost everything, right? For what? Why did we enter this war? At the instigation of the Saudis and Americans,
Sure.
they went into war. So the American ambassador lady, I forget her name now, but famous lady, when Saddam is saying that, look, this thing called Kuwait, and on the map you can see it.
Wasn't it Merrill Albright?
Huh?
Albright, was that?
No, it wasn't Albright. No. It's the ambassador of
Okay.
the United States
Okay.
sitting in the embassy.
Right.
So he's saying, look, what do I show my people? Then he's saying, you see Kuwait, look at the thing on the map. For thousands of years or hundreds of years, this Kuwait was always part of Iraq.
Sure.
Right, the British came and exercised the one part called Kuwait, like they did in Singapore, like
Sure.
they did in Hong Kong, like they did in all these places, right? Kuwait, they removed that part, excised that part. So they did exactly that, excised this thing called Kuwait because it was rich in oil, right? And they said, we'll take control. They did the same thing, whether it is in Brunei, in Indonesia, or Singapore, or Hong Kong, wherever there was wealth or strategic value, they excised it from the main. So they removed Kuwait from Iraq.
Right.
And so Saddam is saying, this was always my country, so I want to take it back. The ambassador of the United States is telling Saddam, egging him on indirectly, and saying, this is your domestic problem. You solve it the way you want to solve it.
So he's given the green light, so to speak.
Yeah, he said, this is your domestic problem.
Sure.
In fighting between you and what it got to do with us? So they immediately she left. Then the next day he entered Kuwait. And Kuwait is a small country, doesn't have very much of an army to speak of. And they just ransacked the country and literally stole everything they could lay their hands on. Money, gold and all. By that time, the Kuwaiti families and royal families and all had escaped and had gone to Saudi Arabia and other countries. So this war costed him, first trapped him into invading Iraq, then gave the opportunity.
Invading Kuwait.
Yeah, for entering Kuwait. Then gave them the opportunity to wage a war against a minuscule, not important person, but brought the whole Western world together,
Sure.
right, to invade
Iraq.
Kuwait. And the idea was that if they do that, three benefits come. One, the Arab puppets will always look to us
So if they
for protection.
So if they came to if America and its allies came to the protection of Kuwait, these are the three benefits, right?
One is to show that all these Emiratis and the Saudis and the monarchies and all the reactionary military men that if you have a problem, we'll sort it out. And they showed him how you sorted it out. I mean, the armies of the Western world coming together for a tiny little place, right, called Kuwait, and they made a big thing of it. But falsely, they gave the idea, if anybody comes to you, see, the gangster will tell you, I'm a Salim, if anybody touches you, I'll fix them up, right?
Sure, protection money,
protection money,
yeah.
big time. Number two, the cost of that war ran into trillions. They put together, you see, every opportunity that the West has to test their weapons. So they make sophisticated weapons, but it's never been tested in the field. So at the cost of Kuwait, all these expensive equipment was used and tested.
Also, military industrial complex
Correct.
make money out of this, right?
That's the whole thing.
Sure.
But first to test them. I'm making something, I don't know if what I'm making I can destroy that house. But Kuwait gave them a perfect chance to lob the thing over there and destroy the house.
So
testing and buying arms.
So Kuwait financed all of this.
Kuwait financed every
Nothing
cent.
came out of America's pocket. In fact,
Nothing.
everything went inside. Everything went into the pocket.
Nothing came out of America's pocket. In other words, it was a Christmas party for the Americans to test their weapons, to give their soldiers on the ground experience, to buy their weapons, to give a wrong impression, right, to the world. You touch my people, and we'll fix you up.
The third reason for this?
The third reason is this, you see. The tyrants of the Arab world, and they kept them. Remember, even though they did what they did to Saddam, they left him in place.
They did. You're right.
Right.
Yeah.
Egypt, they left Nasser in place. Libya, they left Gaddafi in place. So they removed the power of the tyrants, but leave the tyrants there. Right? It's the people later. You see, I remember Saddam Hussein, when his empire had collapsed, he was running like mad, and nobody would give him refuge. Nobody in his whole country was ready to give him security.
Right.
So where does he end up? He ends up in a concrete bunker.
Yes.
Concrete, inside there.
Yes.
Right. And when they finally catch up with him, he comes out looking like a mongrel.
Yes.
Right, hair shriveled. He was suffering inside the place because nobody in his own country was ready to give him any kind of security. So you understand, and the exact same thing they did with Gaddafi. They found him in a tunnel.
Sure.
Right. So when the time came, they abandoned the Shah of Iran. Right.
Correct.
So they are not to be trusted. Right. But the lesson that was learned was that we'll send the armies of the world because they knew that guy could afford it.
So when you look at, in retrospect, when you look back now into this whole war on terror, number one, how did it pan out in the end? How did it finish? And what has it done to the Muslim psyche?
Okay.
This whole war on terror. What has it done
All right.
to our psyche?
First and foremost, understand that when the Soviets occupied Afghanistan, I'm digressing a bit,
Right.
but when they occupied Afghanistan, right, it was a very difficult thing for Muslims generally to accept because the Soviet was communist, right? So when they occupied forcefully, they occupied Afghanistan. Now, in occupying Afghanistan, they couldn't fight the Mujahideen on the ground.
Right.
The Mujahideen run amok in the mountains, behind rocks, mountains. So they used the helicopter gunship.
Yes.
The Soviets used the helicopter gunship, and they controlled that whole area
From
the
area.
air.
Yeah.
Right. Now, George Shultz, the American Secretary of Defense in America under Ronald Reagan, for America's own geopolitical reasons, they understood that if they brought the helicopter gunships down, the Soviets will have no power.
Neutralize them, absolutely.
Neutralize them completely.
Yes.
So they gave them handheld
Rocket launchers.
handheld.
Yeah.
Right.
It's called missile.
Scud missiles.
Yeah, Scud missile.
But imagine in one day they brought down 23 helicopters.
Sure.
And in 1 month, over 400 of them. So the Soviets said they could not go and make a ground invasion, which the Americans tried to do.
Sure.
So they could not enter the country by army, only from the air, and keeping the puppets as
Yeah.
rulers, right?
Yeah.
So at some point, within 3 months of this campaign of the helicopter gunships, bringing them down, the Soviets closed the door on Afghanistan and ran with their tail beneath between their legs. Now remember, the Soviet Union is a superpower. Superpower, not an ordinary power. It's a superpower. And it lost so hopelessly against defenseless, barefooted Afghans. So that was a very big lesson. Now, when it came at a certain time, when the revolution took place in Iran, the Saudis and the monarchies were shaking in their pants because that revolution, in one form or another, would reach their countries and they would be unseated.
Was that the reason why America and the West and the Arab countries created this Shia Sunni? They amplified it.
Yeah, I'll come to that now.
Yeah.
First and foremost, understand that Iran revolution sent shivers down their spine, that the revolution will touch us and we lose all our power. Right. So the Saudis in particular, but the others we don't know too much about, invited the Americans to come and establish the largest base outside America, right, in the desert lands around Riyadh, around Khobar, Khobar, Khobar. The Americans established. Now before they could establish it, Osama bin Laden from Afghanistan comes over to his country and tells the king, we don't need to despoil our land by these foreign forces. Nobody came into our country, kafirs, to come into our country. So don't allow them to come. We can protect ourselves.
From at that time, from Saddam Hussein.
Before Saddam Hussein.
Before Saddam Hussein.
This is now after the revolution, 79,
Right. Long way back.
80.
Yes.
Right, that's the revolution in Iran, and the Saudis and the Emiratis and all of them were scared that the revolution would come and unseat them.
Right.
So they decided to make the base,
Sure.
American base,
Sure.
and the main base was in Khobar.
Got it.
It's out in the
Right.
desert. Before they could do that, Osama bin Laden is telling the king, personally, one-on-one, we don't need these people to protect us. We can protect ourselves. Gave him a warning. But the king didn't listen and invited the Americans to come there and make their bases. And Osama bin Laden carried out one of his biggest operations against this American base.
Yes.
Right. And literally, I think a few hundred of the Americans, when they sent a few trucks loaded with ammunition and bombs and all that into this Khobar, into this American base, and blew it up. Well, 1 week later, the Americans had left. They left Saudi Arabia, right? But that didn't satisfy them. It didn't satisfy the Americans, who lost Iran, the goose that laid the golden egg, and who now lost Saudi Arabia. So they had to create another situation. For what purpose? To have their presence, heavy presence felt on the ground. But before that, because Osama bin Laden was involved, whether we know it or not, whether we believe in it or not, with the bringing down of the Twin Towers and all that. So the Afghans had given him protection. And according to the tribal laws, the tribal system, you don't let your guests down. That's what we are told. Whether it is true or not, but all Americans using the excuse and with their allies send Saddam Hussein back to us.
Osama.
I said Osama back to us. You know that. So they said, no, we can't, this is our guest. So it was a very tense period, and again they issued a threat. The threat was you either send the man, cause all the problem in our country, or we're going to invade you.
So we know there was an excuse, right? What was America's intention to invade Afghanistan? What resources or what strategic position, economic position did Afghanistan hold?
First of all, the Eastern Central Asian countries, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, all these are oil-rich countries, oil and gas.
Right.
And the nearest point of exit for them is through Afghanistan.
Right.
So you lay a pipeline, right, from here to, say, Marisburg.
So that was the strategic
Yeah,
point.
so number one, it's just very strategically placed.
Right.
Number two, it has a lot of its own natural resources,
Right.
things that are needed to make bombs, things that are needed for the essential elements in cars. They are very rich in natural resources,
Right.
right? Have a lot of natural resources. So they decided to make sure that they get those natural resources and they can build their pipelines and their routes
Right.
through Afghanistan. The
Right.
narrowest, everywhere else from Uzbekistan, or they have to travel maybe 10,000 kilometers.
Right.
Through Afghanistan is 1,000 kilometers.
Yes.
So very near. So there were reasons why, and also to teach. A gangster has got one thing always, right? Don't mess with me or the people that I am protecting. Don't mess with us. So to teach them a lesson, they went out on this massive campaign to invade Afghanistan.
Right.
The biggest setback for them was Afghanistan. Remember, the United States did not enter the First World War. Sold arms to the French and British and all that, but didn't physically enter. In the Second World War, they sold the arms, and at the end of it all, very close to the end of it all, they decided to make sure that they enter the war just when Germany was about to collapse.
Yep.
And earn the glory.
Yeah.
Right, so they earned the glory, and but they sold millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of arms.
Arms.
So the Second World War brought together the coalition that brought down Germany. So once the British and the French, who won the Second World War, but destroyed their economies, destroyed their countries, destroyed and killed thousands of their young people. So it was a difficult time for them. And that's why they had to give up their colonies after the Second World War, not before. Before that, they were masters of the world. But after the Second World War, one after the other country was given independence. Right? The ones that they held on to were the weak ones. For example, Brunei, right? Sultan Bolkiah and his father, Brunei, very rich in oil. Kuwait, Singapore, and so forth. These were countries that they continue to have a control over because they provide. Now imagine in Brunei, Indonesia, the entire British Fifth Fleet and the Second Division, thousands of men, and the Air Force, all parked in Brunei, right? Paid for by the Brunei government. Right? Can you imagine how this post-colonial period exists? So when we look at what happened at the end of the Second World War, we lost Palestine and we lost Masjid al-Aqsa. So many of these countries where the new rulers came in, they were the lackeys of the former colonial masters. So many of them were trained in Sandhurst in England, and I'll give you the names of the people, and Lycine in France. So Nyerere from Sudan, Gaddafi from Libya, Nasser and his cohorts, including the present fellow, trained at Sandhurst. Jordan, the biggest collaborator in the Middle East, Jordan. So all these people were trained in the military academies of Britain and France. And at the press of a button, they would tell them their man there, Gaddafi, time to take over. Nyerere, time to take over. And the monarchies, right, the reactionary monarchies, also were trained. For example, King Hussein of Jordan and his son spent more time in the royal palaces of England than they did in their own countries. Thoroughly British, thoroughly, we don't know too much about them because it's all on the wraps. So we are ruled by people, neo-colonialists, we are ruled by people who become the masters' puppets. And that's why we have a problem. Right now, can you imagine that Bahrain, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, United Arab, all opening embassies, Sudan, Morocco, opening Israeli embassies. That's a denial of everything that you stand for. But they have no shame. And they open these embassies in all these countries. So they have abandoned the cause of liberating us, Al-Aqsa, and given it, and America and Britain. Now, in the worst possible time, at this particular time, this guy, they call him the clown now. Who? Boris Johnson. The French president called him a clown, ruling over a great country. Imagine now he says that Hamas, not the military wing, the whole of Hamas is a terrorist organization. Now, what the hell has he got to do with that? But just to show his point, as the inheritor of the British Empire, right? So, if we are able to, and we have an election, this time, last time they won by 80%, Hamas, both West Bank and Gaza. This time they'll win by 100%. So what will the British do? Who they want to negotiate with? Though people have voted for the Hamas,
sure,
right? So in this way, we find ourselves in a very awkward position where the rulers of our countries are the lackeys of the powerful British, American, and French and other European powers.
I think we'll end it in the last few minutes to wrap up maybe politics and current. I mean, you started with it now, contemporary politics, maybe, and just wrap it up with whatever you wish to speak on.
No, just imagine the Prophet ﷺ is in a place where those Arabs were never able to fight anybody, and nobody wanted to fight them. Those Arabs were useless people, right? As I was telling you, that Gibbs said, the Arabs of the time were neither reliable friends nor dependable enemies. No country in the world of the time, the powers, whether it's Roman or Greek or Egyptian, Syrian, Persian, nobody wanted to enter the Arabian heartland. Not worth it. So these people who had no value in the eyes of the world, when the Prophet ﷺ from Medina sends a message to a superpower king of Iran, I invite you to accept Islam. Hey, he was mad. Who's this upstart? So he declares war on the Prophet. The same thing with the Romans. Who is this upstart? Where does he come from? Who does he think he is? Asking us to accept his way of life. Right? Again, so wars on both sides were created against this nascent Muslim country. And what happens? They defeat both the superpowers of the day. Defeat the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. And the whole region become Muslim. You must remember when Islam entered Iran, within 10 years, the entire Persian community had accepted Islam. Within 10 years. It was just a natural reaction. In Syria, on the other hand, it took 100 years before the Syrians accepted Islam. There were people accepting Islam, but 100 years, no force, all right? So Muslims entered war as a defensive war against the two superpowers of the day. So in South African and world corner, we entered the war with America and its allies in Afghanistan. And we entered the war in so many other places, right? Whether it was in Somalia or whether it was in Lebanon, where the Americans had to run, right? They couldn't fight the Muslims. So what does it tell you? There is a power greater than the most sophisticated power that they have. And we are able to show by, it's no miracle, just the force of Iman, right? How to defeat the superpowers of the world.
Thank you, Brother Ebrahim. I think that's it for today. Inshallah, we can keep on talking, you know, but I think we restricted to an hour now. Inshallah. So next week we probably continue.
Was it relevant?
Very relevant. Thank you.
Right.
Jazakallah.
Sure.